In cities across the world, emergency hotlines receive thousands of calls each day. Most of them are routine noise complaints, disturbances, or requests for assistance that are quickly resolved and forgotten. But every so often, one of those calls stands apart, not for its urgency alone, but for the unanswered questions it leaves behind. On the night this particular report came in, the operator logged it as a standard complaint. A neighbor had called 311, reporting violent cries and loud banging coming from apartment 12B of an aging residential building. The address was familiar to authorities. This was not the first time complaints had been filed regarding that unit. Yet when officers responded, what they encountered did not match the report, or any logical explanation. The apartment in question was supposed to be empty. Records confirmed that no one had been leasing 12B for several months, and the landlord had even reported difficulties renting it out due to its strange history. Neighbors insisted the sounds had been clear. Screaming, weeping voices that echoed through the night like a desperate plea. But the responding officers, after gaining entry, documented nothing that could justify such reports. There were no residents, no furniture, no signs of recent habitation, just an unwelcoming stillness that seemed heavier than silence itself. What began as a routine complaint quickly transformed into an unsolved riddle, one that still unsettles those who dare to speak about it. The unsettling detail was not merely that apartment 12B appeared empty, but that it had long carried a reputation within the building, a reputation that few tenants were willing to speak of openly. Former residents whispered about sudden drafts, walls that seemed to carry whispers long after the halls fell silent, and an oppressive sensation of being watched, even when alone. Some stayed for weeks, others for months, but nearly all departed without warning, often breaking their leases and leaving behind belongings they never returned to collect. To outsiders, it might seem like nothing more than urban superstition, the kind of gossip that grows around any old building. But those who lived near 12B insisted the atmosphere was different, heavier, as though the very walls were steeped in sorrow. By the time the 311 complaint was filed, apartment 12B was already notorious. In fact, city records showed that in the past 3 decades, more calls had originated from that single unit, despite it being unoccupied for long stretches, than from any other apartment in the building. Tenants in neighboring units claimed they often heard faint sobbing at odd hours, particularly around 3:11 in the morning, a coincidence they found too eerie to dismiss. Others described muffled laughter, like children playing in the halls, though no children lived nearby. For those who endured these disturbances, the complaint that night was not surprising. It was simply another chapter in a long and unsettling history. Yet this time, the strangeness took on a sharper edge. The call that prompted the police response was later traced, not to a concerned neighbor, but to the landline registered directly to apartment 12B, a unit that should have been silent and empty. When officers finally entered apartment 12B, their official report described a scene that was both ordinary and deeply unsettling. The unit was bare, stripped of personal possessions, with walls that carried the faded marks of frames and furniture long since removed. Yet something about the space felt wrong, as though it resisted their presence. The first detail noted was the temperature. Despite the rest of the building being heated, the air inside was unnaturally cold, nearly 10 degrees lower than the hallway outside. Their flashlights cut through a dust-filled stillness, but the dust itself was oddly disturbed, as though someone or something had moved through recently. The floor bore faint scuff marks leading into the bedroom, but no footprints clear enough to follow. On the bedroom walls, the officers noticed deep scratches etched into the paint, claw-like lines that dragged downward as though made in desperation. There were no animals reported in the building, and no logical explanation for their presence. The lock on the front door was found secured from the inside, leaving no indication of forced entry or recent use. Their radios crackled intermittently. Body cameras recorded only static once they crossed the threshold, and attempts to call dispatch from within the apartment failed until they stepped back into the hallway. Despite the unsettling circumstances, no physical evidence of a crime was discovered. No bodies, no squatters, nothing that could explain the screams reported in the 311 call. The official conclusion listed the case as unfounded, Yet even the responding officers admitted privately that something about apartment 12B lingered in their thoughts long after they left. In the weeks that followed, the incident of apartment 12B spread quietly among residents of the building, whispered in hushed tones in stairwells and laundry rooms. Many were not surprised by the outcome. To them, 12B had always been a place marked by misfortune. Some remembered the family that left in the middle of the night decades earlier, never returning for their belongings. Others recalled the disappearance of a young woman in 1991, who had herself phoned authorities complaining of strange voices before vanishing without a trace. Even the landlord, pressed by investigators, admitted he struggled to keep tenants in that unit. Some broke their leases within days, refusing to give reasons beyond vague descriptions of not feeling safe. Apartment 12B became less a residence than a shadow, a space within the building that most preferred to ignore. And yet, the 311 complaint that night remained impossible to dismiss. Calls can be traced, and this one was logged from within the apartment itself. But according to rental records, no one had lived there for months. The landline was supposed to be disconnected, its service long canceled. How, then, could a voice have called for help from a place officially vacant? Authorities offered no answers, simply closing the case as a false report. Still, for those who lived nearby, the cries never stopped. Neighbors continued to insist they heard weeping at odd hours, the muffled sounds of someone trapped just beyond the walls. To this day, apartment 12B stands sealed, its door locked, its windows covered in dust, yet its reputation alive in every whispered retelling. What began as a routine complaint has become an unresolved riddle, one that continues to echo, unanswered, through the corridors of the abandoned house. The night of the complaint began like any other. The building was quiet, its hallways dimly lit, and most residents were asleep or winding down for the evening. At exactly 11:47 p.m., the city's 311 hotline received a call that would soon capture the attention of dispatchers and officers alike. The voice on the other end was strained, panicked, and nearly drowned by background noise. The caller reported violent cries and furious banging coming from apartment 12B. They insisted it sounded like someone was being attacked or worse, tortured inside the unit. According to the transcript, the voice pleaded, "Please send someone. They won't stop screaming." The operator attempted to calm the caller, asking for their name, but the line abruptly went dead before identification could be confirmed. On its own, the report was not unusual. Noise complaints were a daily occurrence, and calls describing possible domestic disputes were not uncommon. But two details stood out immediately. First, the audio captured faint sounds in the background. A woman's cries, sharp bangs against a wall, and what some described later as a child's faint laughter. Second, when dispatchers checked the address, they realized the call had been placed not by a concerned neighbor, but directly from apartment 12B itself. The records showed the number belonged to the landline still registered to that unit, even though service had supposedly been disconnected months earlier. The operator marked the complaint urgent, and within minutes, patrol officers were dispatched to investigate. What they would find inside 12B was far from the ordinary disturbances they had expected. The responding officers arrived at the building just after midnight. According to their reports, the hallways were quiet, but several tenants had gathered near the stairwell, clearly unsettled by what they had heard. One neighbor from apartment 12A told officers she had been woken by violent pounding on the shared wall, followed by what she described as a woman crying hysterically. Another, from down the hall, claimed he heard both crying and what sounded like a child calling out for help. These testimonies were consistent with the 311 call, and each tenant was adamant that the noises came specifically from 12B. When officers approached the door, however, they were met with silence. They knocked repeatedly, identifying themselves, but there was no response from inside. The door itself was locked, and no light was visible through the cracks or peephole. One officer later wrote in his notes that the air outside the unit felt stale and unusually cold, as though something had drained the warmth from the hallway. Another described the atmosphere as thick, like the quiet before a storm. Standard procedure required them to attempt contact with the landlord, who confirmed, again, that the apartment was vacant and should not have had any occupants. After several failed attempts to get a response, the officers made the decision to force entry, believing the possibility of an injured person justified immediate action. The moment the door gave way, their flashlights revealed an empty living room coated in dust. No furniture remained, no personal belongings, and no sign of recent habitation. The silence was absolute. Yet the officers agreed on one strange detail. The air inside was noticeably colder than the hallway they had just stepped from, enough to see faint puffs of breath in the beams of their flashlights. It was in this unnatural stillness that the investigation into apartment 12B truly began. Inside the apartment, the officers conducted a full sweep. They checked the kitchen, the bathroom, the closets, and the small bedroom at the back of the unit. What struck them most was not what they found, but what they did not. There was no furniture, no dishes, no clothing, not even dust-covered remnants of old tenants. The space was stripped bare, yet it did not feel abandoned. Scattered across the floor were faint scuff marks, as though heavy objects had once been dragged and then removed in haste. The dust that covered the surfaces bore gaps, suggesting movement far more recent than months of vacancy should have allowed. The most disturbing discovery came in the bedroom. Along the far wall, deep scratches had been etched into the paint. They trailed downward in uneven lines, some clustered as if made by fingernails, others long and jagged, reaching nearly from ceiling to floor. The officers noted that the patterns looked less like vandalism and more like desperate clawing. But clawing from whom or for what reason, no one could say. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks or windows. Even the front door had been secured from the inside. And yet, according to neighbors, less than an hour earlier, the unit had been alive with violent noise. When the sweep was complete, no one was found inside. No victim, no suspect, not even a trace of someone having lived there in recent days. Their equipment had recorded little of value, with some devices malfunctioning the moment they stepped through the threshold. After nearly an hour, the officers had little choice but to classify the call as no findings. The report was filed, the case marked as closed, and apartment 12B was once again locked and left behind. But the neighbors would continue to insist that the cries had been real. To this day, the unanswered question lingers. Who, or what, placed that call from inside a room that should have been empty? To understand why the 311 complaints stirred such unease, one must look beyond the single night it occurred and into the long shadow cast by apartment 12B. The building itself was constructed in 1973, part of a wave of affordable housing projects meant to provide stability for working families. On the surface, it was unremarkable, a modest mid-rise with plain hallways, identical units, and the sort of anonymity common in urban life. Yet, from its earliest years, apartment 12B gained a reputation that set it apart. The first recorded incident dates back to the mid-1970s, when a young couple moved into the unit. They reportedly broke their lease after only 3 weeks, telling the landlord that they couldn't sleep with the crying. At the time, their claims were dismissed as exaggeration, perhaps an excuse to leave early. But over the decades, similar stories accumulated. Families came and went, often in the middle of the night, leaving possessions behind as though escape was more urgent than closure. Tenants complained of strange drafts, unexplained cold spots, and the persistent sense that they were not alone. Most spoke of voices, soft at first, then louder, voices that seemed to rise from within the walls. Officially, there was nothing unusual about the apartment. Maintenance records showed standard wear and tear, nothing extraordinary. Yet those who lived there insisted otherwise. Children spoke of an unseen woman sitting by their beds at night, weeping quietly. Adults described waking to find themselves paralyzed, staring at shadows that shifted along the walls. Each story was slightly different, but they all shared the same conclusion. Apartment 12B was unlivable. By the late 1980s, the unit had one of the highest turnover rates in the city, with some residents lasting less than a month before abandoning it altogether. By the early 1990s, apartment 12B's reputation had begun to spread beyond the building itself. Neighbors recalled one particularly disturbing case from 1991, when a young woman living in the unit phoned authorities in the middle of the night. Her report was chillingly similar to those that would come decades later. She insisted voices were whispering through her walls, that someone was crying in her bedroom though she was alone, and that she could hear the sound of footsteps pacing just beyond her door. Officers were dispatched, but by the time they arrived, the woman was gone. Her apartment was locked from the inside, with no sign of forced entry. She was never seen again, and her disappearance remains unsolved. This case cemented 12B's infamy. Tenants began to refuse even temporary stays, and some landlords quietly advised prospective renters to avoid it altogether. Still, financial pressures forced some families to take the unit despite its history. Many of them did not last long. One family in 1997 reportedly abandoned the apartment after only 10 days, leaving their belongings exactly as they were. When asked why, they explained simply, "Our son won't stop talking to the woman in the corner." They described their child pointing toward an empty space, insisting someone was standing there, watching. Other reports throughout the late 1990s and early 2000s described unnerving phenomena. Lights flickering without cause, doors slamming in the middle of the night, and persistent smells of smoke or burning wires despite no electrical issues being found. In each case, the disturbances were strongest around 3:11 a.m., a detail that grew into a whispered legend among residents. By then, neighbors had adopted the phrase the cries of 12B, a shorthand for the unexplained noises that seemed to echo through the building long after the apartment should have fallen silent. As the years passed, the building changed owners multiple times, yet apartment 12B remained a constant problem. Property managers tried everything: new locks, renovations, even extended vacancies, but nothing erased its reputation. Whenever the unit was rented out, the new tenants rarely lasted. Some left without explanation, while others filed formal complaints before breaking their leases. These complaints often repeated the same unnerving themes: unexplained weeping, the sound of furniture being dragged across the floor at night, and voices calling names that no one recognized. Maintenance staff also grew wary of the unit. One worker in 2004 claimed he was sent to fix a leaking pipe, only to abandon the task when he heard someone whisper his name from the empty bedroom. Another reported seeing a reflection in the bathroom mirror that did not match his own movements, describing it as a figure standing just behind his shoulder. Word spread quickly among staff, and many refused to enter the unit alone. Eventually, managers had to schedule repairs in pairs, but even then, work orders often went unfinished. City records reveal a troubling pattern. 3 separate missing persons cases are linked, directly or indirectly, to apartment 12B. In each instance, the individuals were last known to have lived in or visited the unit shortly before disappearing. Though no evidence ever tied the apartment conclusively to the vanishings, the pattern was unsettling enough that investigators noted it in their files. Still, without proof, nothing more could be done. Over time, the unit's notoriety became a kind of local folklore. Children in the neighborhood dared one another to knock on the door, while adults spoke of it in hushed tones, careful not to linger near it after dark. By the 2010s, apartment 12B had become less a home and more an empty shell, a place that existed in the building but remained untouched. The landlord admitted privately that he could no longer convince anyone to sign a lease, no matter how low the rent was set. Word of mouth spread too easily, and the stories had become too numerous to ignore. Neighbors swore the unit was not truly empty. Even when no one lived there, they claimed to hear faint knocks from behind the walls, as though someone were trying to get out. Some described hearing a telephone ring inside, though the line had long since been disconnected. Others insisted they could see shadows moving past the windows at night, despite the blinds being drawn. The few who dared enter in recent years often reported the same oppressive feeling, a heaviness that settled over them the moment they crossed the threshold, like being unwelcome in a place they had no right to be. Visitors described sudden dizziness, headaches, and an inexplicable urge to leave as quickly as possible. Some even spoke of hearing voices calling their name in a low, pleading tone. None of these experiences could be verified, of course, but they added to the ever-growing legend of the unit. For those who had lived in the building long enough, apartment 12B became a symbol of unresolved sorrow, a wound in the structure itself. It was not just an empty room. It was a space saturated with unanswered questions, rumors of tragedy, and stories too consistent to dismiss outright. By the time the infamous 311 complaint was logged, the apartment was already a place of fear and fascination. The call was not the beginning of the mystery, but the latest echo in a history that stretched back decades. And for those who still live near its door, that history has never stopped repeating. For those who lived nearest to apartment 12B, the mystery was never just rumor or legend. It was an experience woven into their daily lives. Residents of neighboring units, particularly 12A and 12C, carried with them stories of nights disrupted by noises that no amount of logic could explain. Many claimed they first noticed the disturbances at the same time, just after 3 in the morning, when the building was at its quietest. The pattern was so consistent that some began referring to the 311 cries, a chilling nod to both the time the disturbances peaked and the infamous hotline number that would later be tied to the complaint. One longtime tenant recalled waking to the sound of someone sobbing through the wall. At first, she thought it was her neighbor in 12B, but when she pressed her ear closer, she realized the crying seemed layered, like more than one voice weeping at once. When she mentioned it to the landlord, he reminded her the unit was vacant. Another neighbor described hearing heavy thuds, like fists pounding against drywall, often followed by silence so abrupt it felt staged. These incidents were not isolated. Multiple families, spanning decades, recounted the same phenomena in interviews and complaints. What unsettled most witnesses was not simply the noise itself, but the strange details that accompanied it. Several residents claimed that their pets, usually calm and quiet, would grow agitated whenever they passed the door of 12B. Dogs barked at the empty hallway. Cats hissed or refused to step near the threshold. Some swore they saw shadows under the doorframe, as if someone were pacing inside, though the apartment was confirmed empty at the time. For those who lived beside or across from the unit, apartment 12B was never just another neighbor. It was a presence, and it made its existence known in ways that could not easily be ignored. Among the most unsettling accounts came from families with children. Over the years, several parents reported that their sons and daughters spoke of friends who lived in the walls of apartment 12B. One mother recalled her 5-year-old daughter waking in the middle of the night, insisting that the crying lady had been sitting at the foot of her bed. The child described the figure in detail, a pale woman with dark, sunken eyes. Yet when the mother searched the apartment, nothing was there. Another resident told investigators that his young son would stand at the shared wall between 12A and 12B, holding long conversations with someone he called the woman who cries. The child insisted she was trapped and needed help, a claim that left the family so disturbed they moved out within a week. Adults, too, reported unnerving experiences. One tenant from 12C recounted waking to hear what sounded like a child laughing softly in the hallway, only to discover it was coming from behind 12B's locked door. A man living on the floor above claimed he often heard furniture dragging late at night, like chairs or tables being moved, though the apartment below was empty. In every case, when management checked, the unit was still vacant, the dust undisturbed. What gave these testimonies credibility was their consistency across time. Different tenants, from different backgrounds and decades apart, reported the same details. Crying at odd hours, children's voices, dragging noises, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. Few neighbors were willing to discuss their experiences openly, fearing ridicule, but many quietly admitted that the disturbances became so unbearable they were forced to leave. For them, apartment 12B was less a mystery and more an active threat to their peace of mind. Not all testimonies came from tenants. Visitors, maintenance staff, and even delivery workers occasionally spoke of their own unsettling encounters near apartment 12B. One maintenance man claimed that while repairing a leaking pipe in the hallway, he heard a woman's voice whisper his name from behind the locked door. Thinking perhaps a squatter had broken in, he called for backup. When the unit was opened, it was empty. Another staff member described leaving tools inside while working on the ceiling fixtures, only to return minutes later and find them neatly stacked in the center of the bare living room. He swore he had not placed them that way. A delivery driver recounted being asked to bring a package to 12B one evening. When he arrived, the hallway was silent, But as he stood outside the door, he distinctly heard a phone ringing inside. He knocked repeatedly, but no one answered. Later, when he asked the landlord about the resident, he was told the apartment was vacant, and that the landline had been disconnected years before. Neighbors also began to share more subtle experiences. Some said they could feel vibrations through the walls, as though someone were pounding on them from the inside. Others described sudden changes in temperature as they passed the door, air turning icy cold in the middle of a summer afternoon. One woman from 11B, directly below, told friends she often woke to the sound of dripping water, but when she investigated, there was no leak, only the faint smell of rust or iron seeping through her ceiling. These testimonies were never formally catalogued by authorities, yet they persisted across decades, retold in whispers among residents. For those who lived in the building, they became part of daily reality. Apartment 12B was not just empty space. It was active in its own way, and everyone who came near it eventually noticed. Perhaps the most disturbing testimonies were those that spoke not only of noises or sensations, but of direct encounters. One former tenant from 12A recalled waking one night to see a shadow moving across her ceiling, stretching from the shared wall with 12B. At first, she assumed it was headlights from a passing car, but when she looked out the window, the street below was empty. The shadow, she claimed, moved slowly, almost deliberately, and vanished only when she turned on the lights. Another resident swore he once saw a pale hand press against the frosted glass pane of 12B's door, fingers splayed, before retreating into darkness. Over time, the fear of apartment 12B became communal. Families on the 12th floor developed unspoken rules. Children were told not to linger in the hallway, and adults avoided standing too long outside the door. Some tenants admitted to rerouting their daily routines just to steer clear of passing it. The fear grew so entrenched that when new residents moved in, they were often warned by neighbors within days, "Stay away from 12B." Despite the silence of official records, the weight of these testimonies is undeniable. Dozens of individuals, spanning generations, told nearly identical stories of cries in the night, laughter where none should be, and presences that seemed to linger just beyond sight. Some dismissed these accounts as hysteria or exaggeration. Others believed they pointed to something deeper, an unresolved tragedy that had seeped into the very walls of the building. Regardless of explanation, the testimonies transformed apartment 12B into something larger than a single apartment. It became a symbol of unease, a place where ordinary life and the unexplained collided, and where those who lived nearby were left carrying memories they would never forget. When complaints about apartment 12B began to escalate, authorities had little choice but to respond. The infamous 311 call that brought the case wider attention wasn't the first report, but it became the most publicized. On record, the caller described hearing unrelenting cries from inside the unit, at times resembling a woman, at times a child. The caller insisted the sounds had continued for hours and were so loud they could no longer sleep. The dispatcher treated it as a possible domestic dispute or a case of child endangerment, and officers were sent to investigate. When police arrived, however, the situation took an unexpected turn. The apartment was locked from the outside, and management confirmed no tenant was on the lease at the time. With consent from the landlord, officers forced entry. Inside, they found the unit empty. Dust settled thick across the furniture, the refrigerator unplugged, and no personal belongings present. Yet the responding officers themselves later noted an unusual detail. The air inside felt oppressively heavy, carrying with it a faint odor of mildew and iron. One officer swore he heard what sounded like a faint sob just as they began their sweep, though his partner dismissed it as the sound of pipes or settling wood. The official report filed that night lists no persons found, and closes the case as no further action required. Yet for many in the building, the arrival of law enforcement validated their fears. They had long spoken of the cries, and now someone else, outsiders trained to look for rational explanations, had been forced to acknowledge at least the possibility that something unusual was occurring within 12BS walls. Though the first official search yielded nothing, the complaints did not stop. Over the next several years, calls to 311 and direct requests to the local precinct referenced apartment 12B again and again. The pattern was always similar. Reports of loud crying, banging against walls, or voices that sounded distressed. Each time officers were dispatched, and each time the result was the same. An empty unit, no sign of forced entry, no evidence of trespassers. Still, some officers privately admitted the case unsettled them. One patrolman recounted entering the apartment with his partner in 2012 after multiple neighbors reported screams. While sweeping the rooms, he claimed to hear the sound of running footsteps just ahead of them, moving deeper into the apartment. Certain they had cornered an intruder, they rushed into the bedroom, only to find it empty. Dust on the floor showed no disturbance, and the windows were sealed shut. Another officer described feeling as though someone was standing just behind him as he checked the kitchen. He even radioed for backup, convinced they had missed a suspect. When his partner insisted no one else was inside, the officer refused to finish the sweep and left the unit. The building's management grew frustrated with the recurring police involvement. They argued the disturbances were wasting city resources, that prank calls or mass hysteria were fueling the problem. But residents pushed back, insisting the cries were real and persistent. For them, the very presence of officers, again and again, proved the problem was not imagined. Even if nothing tangible was found, the fact that law enforcement kept returning confirmed that apartment 12B could not be dismissed so easily. As reports accumulated, some investigators attempted to treat apartment 12B less as a crime scene and more as a recurring disturbance. Noise complaints, after all, were common in the city. But the sheer consistency of what neighbors described, the cries, the banging, the voices, drew the attention of a small group of detectives who began to quietly track the case across years. They noticed that the calls peaked at odd hours, often between 2:45 and 3:30 a.m., with many residents independently citing 311 as the exact moment the noises were loudest. This precision unsettled even the most skeptical officers. In one attempt to resolve the matter, surveillance equipment was briefly installed in the hallway outside the unit. For several nights, nothing unusual occurred. Then, on the fifth night, neighbors filed another complaint, claiming the cries had returned. When officers reviewed the footage, they saw no intruder entering or leaving, yet the microphone recorded a faint, rhythmic thudding sound coming directly from 12B. The sound lasted almost 10 minutes before abruptly stopping. Technical specialists later suggested it could have been building vibrations or faulty wiring, but others weren't convinced, particularly since the timing matched multiple resident testimonies. The deeper police looked into the unit's past, the more troubling details they uncovered. Old case files revealed missing persons investigations loosely connected to tenants of 12B. While none offered hard proof, the records painted a pattern that was difficult to ignore. Residents moving in, disturbances beginning, and sudden departures or disappearances soon after. Though officially categorized as unsubstantiated, these connections created an internal divide among officers. Some pushed to pursue the case further, while others argued it was an endless loop without evidence, destined to drain resources. By the late 2010s, apartment 12B had earned an unofficial status within the precinct, a case no one wanted but everyone knew. Rookie officers were sometimes warned before responding, "If it's 12B, don't expect much except chills." Veterans rolled their eyes, but many privately admitted they'd rather be called to a real disturbance than another night standing in that silent, heavy apartment. One of the final documented visits came after multiple 311 calls reported violent screaming from the unit. Responding officers arrived just after 3 a.m. The hallway was quiet, but neighbors insisted the cries had ended only minutes before. Entry was forced once again, and once again the apartment appeared undisturbed. Yet both officers later testified, off the record, that they heard something inside while searching, a low, drawn-out sob that seemed to come from beneath the floorboards. When they investigated, there was nothing. No crawl space, no access panels, only solid concrete. At this point, the police presence began to fade. Officially, the department considered the matter closed, classifying new calls as unfounded noise complaints. Off the record, however, Some admitted the case was left unresolved because no one could explain it. The reports were too numerous, too consistent, and too strange to dismiss as simple hoaxes, yet no physical evidence ever tied the Cries to a crime. For the residents, the retreat of law enforcement was not a relief but a sentence. Without police involvement, the Cries of apartment 12B became something they were expected to live with. The building carried on. Tenants moved in and out, but the reputation of the unit only deepened. For many, the police investigation confirmed what they had long suspected. 12B was not a problem that could be solved by procedure or patrols. It was something else entirely, an unresolved presence that refused to be silenced. With official investigations stalled and no evidence to settle the matter, the mystery of apartment 12B slipped into the hands of the public. Neighbors, locals, and eventually internet forums began crafting explanations, some grounded in history, others steeped in folklore. The apartment became a canvas onto which every unexplained sound or tragedy was projected. One of the earliest theories centered on the idea of a forgotten tragedy. Some claimed a family had once perished in 12B, their cries forever imprinted on the walls. The story varied. In one version, a mother and child were trapped in a fire that swept the building decades earlier. In another, a man took his own life after a series of financial hardships. Though building records confirmed minor fires and at least one suicide, no direct evidence tied them specifically to the apartment. Still, the narrative persisted because it offered something the official reports never could, a human origin for the Cries. Another legend suggested the Cries were not of this era at all, but echoes of something older. Amateur historians pointed out that the building was constructed on land, once occupied by tenement housing in the early 1900s, where disease and poverty claimed countless lives. Perhaps, they argued, 12B was a point of thinness, where the past leaked through into the present. The timing of the disturbances, always around 3:11 a.m., was interpreted as a veil hour, when barriers between worlds are weakest. These theories spread quickly, gaining traction not only in the neighborhood but online. As videos, blog posts, and amateur investigations appeared, apartment 12B became more than a local nuisance. It became a story people wanted to believe, a living legend fueled by unanswered questions and the eerie consistency of the Cries. As word of apartment 12B spread online, theories began to take on a darker, more supernatural tone. Paranormal enthusiasts proposed that the unit was not merely haunted, but cursed. They pointed to the disappearances loosely tied to the apartment, claiming the space demanded a toll from those who entered. According to this line of thought, the cries heard by neighbors were not echoes of the past but active lures, drawing new victims toward the apartment before silencing them forever. While impossible to prove, the chilling idea explained why so many tenants abandoned the unit suddenly, leaving behind personal belongings as if fleeing in haste. Another theory suggested the cries were not human at all. Some residents whispered about an entity bound to the apartment, something that mimicked human voices to provoke fear. Supporters of this idea cited testimonies where neighbors claimed the cries sometimes shifted tone, sobbing one moment, laughter the next, or a voice calling a tenant's name directly. To believers, this inconsistency hinted at something non-human, something that played with its audience like an actor changing masks. Skeptics, however, offered more grounded explanations. They argued the cries could be the result of acoustics in the building, where sounds from other apartments funneled strangely into 12BS walls. Old plumbing, they said, could produce groans and bangs easily mistaken for voices or footsteps. Others suspected deliberate hoaxes, neighbors pranking one another, or opportunists exploiting the apartment's reputation to keep it empty for their own purposes. Yet even skeptics admitted unease at the sheer consistency of reports across decades. Acoustic quirks might explain a few cases, but could they explain cries always occurring around the same hour, or the multiple officers who claimed to hear something themselves? Beyond supernatural speculation, some theories about apartment 12B focused on psychological and social explanations. A few researchers suggested the apartment had become what psychologists call a contagious haunting, not necessarily a site of paranormal activity, but a place where fear itself spread like an infection. According to this view, once enough people believed 12B was cursed, Every creak, groan, or distant noise was reinterpreted as proof of the legend. Over time, residents may have unconsciously amplified the story, feeding one another's anxieties until it became self-sustaining. Still, others argued that something tangible fueled the legend. Amateur investigators pointed out unusual health complaints tied to tenants of 12B. Headaches, dizziness, nausea, and even hallucinations. They speculated about environmental causes, mold hidden in the walls, carbon monoxide leaks, or electrical issues creating infrasound, the low-frequency vibrations known to trigger feelings of dread or auditory illusions. This theory had scientific backing. Studies show prolonged exposure to infrasound can make people feel as though they are being watched, or hear voices that aren't there. Could 12B have been a perfect storm of environmental hazards, misinterpreted as something supernatural? Yet even those inclined toward science found gaps in this explanation. Inspectors who entered the apartment over the years never documented extreme mold or gas leaks. Electrical tests came back within normal ranges. If an environmental issue was to blame, it left no measurable trace. And so the questions returned, circling back to the unexplained. Why only 12B? Why always at the same time of night? And why did people describe the same chilling details across decades, as if they were all witnessing fragments of a single, repeating event? Over time, apartment 12B became less of a physical space and more of a symbol, a nexus of unanswered questions that drew in storytellers, skeptics, and believers alike. Online forums filled with debates. Some argued it was proof of the paranormal, others insisted it was a case study in mass hysteria. Local residents, meanwhile, continued to live with the reality of its presence, their lives shaped by the stories whether they believed them or not. Urban legends flourished. Some claimed that if you stood outside the door at exactly 3:11 a.m., you would hear your own name whispered back to you. Others said anyone who stayed inside for a full night alone would dream of drowning, only to wake with damp sheets and the scent of rust in the air. A particularly unsettling rumor held that photographs taken inside the unit never developed properly, always showing streaks of shadow across the frame as if something unseen had crossed the lens. At the same time, rational voices continued to push back. Skeptics insisted the stories persisted not because of supernatural forces but because humans are drawn to mystery. The Cries of 12B became a communal myth, a way for people to give shape to the unease of living in a decaying building. Yet even skeptics admitted that some details, the disappearances, the officers' testimonies, the consistency of the 3:11 timing, remained stubbornly difficult to explain. In the end, the theories surrounding apartment 12B reveal as much about human nature as they do about the apartment itself. People need explanations for the unexplainable, and when official answers fall short, legends take root. Whether curse, echo, hoax, or hazard, 12B became a mirror of those fears. A place where every unanswered sound could be transformed into a story, and every story into a lasting piece of the legend. By the time the infamous 311 complaint circulated publicly, apartment 12B was no longer just a local curiosity. It had entered the realm of cultural folklore. News outlets first covered the story cautiously, treating it as an unusual case of noise complaints and superstitious neighbors. Yet the details proved irresistible. An abandoned apartment, cries heard in the dead of night, repeated police responses with no explanation. Headlines branded 12B as the crying apartment, and the story quickly spread beyond the neighborhood. Local media gave the case regular attention, interviewing residents who recounted their experiences in shaky voices. Some spoke on camera, while others insisted on anonymity, fearing ridicule. The stories shared were eerily consistent. Voices, weeping, shadows, and the overwhelming sense of being watched. Even skeptical journalists admitted there was something unnerving about how often these accounts overlapped. The coverage fueled interest, and soon radio stations and late-night talk shows were debating whether 12B was a haunting, a hoax, or a hidden crime scene. Social media amplified the story further. Clips of news segments were uploaded online, and within days the case had its own hashtags. Amateur sleuths shared maps, timelines, and theories, Paranormal investigators uploaded grainy hallway footage and EVP recordings they claimed were captured near the apartment. Some videos were debunked, others dismissed as clickbait, but the effect was the same. Apartment 12B became a viral mystery, endlessly dissected and discussed. This wave of coverage transformed the building itself. Once an anonymous structure in a crowded city, it became a point of fascination. Curious visitors began showing up at all hours, hoping to hear the cries for themselves. For those who lived there, media attention was a double-edged sword. It validated their fears, but also brought strangers knocking at their doors, hungry for a glimpse of the legend. As the story spread, Apartment 12B began attracting the attention of independent filmmakers, writers, and content creators eager to capitalize on its eerie reputation. Documentaries, some professional, others more amateur, featured dimly lit interviews with neighbors, spliced with ominous shots of the 12th floor hallway. One streaming platform even greenlit a short investigative series, framing 12B as the city's most documented unsolved haunting. Though critics dismissed much of the footage as inconclusive, audiences were drawn to the unsettling atmosphere. Writers, too, seized on the legend. True crime blogs examined the possibility of criminal activity being concealed within the apartment's history, while horror authors reimagined the cries as part of cursed narratives. Apartment 12B became a backdrop for online creepypastas, YouTube horror readings, and even short films that dramatized the mysterious disappearances. In each adaptation, the unit was not simply a location. It was a character, a presence that embodied dread. This surge in coverage also drew paranormal investigators in droves. Some brought sophisticated equipment, setting up cameras, audio recorders, and electromagnetic detectors. Others were little more than thrill seekers with flashlights. While most documented little more than silence and shadows, a handful of clips gained notoriety. Muffled sobs faintly captured on tape, or unexplained knocks coinciding with questions shouted into the apartment. Whether authentic or staged, these recordings circulated widely, reinforcing the idea that 12B was something more than just an empty room. Meanwhile, residents of the building grew increasingly frustrated. For them, the media attention was intrusive. Strangers loitered in their halls, knocking on the infamous door at odd hours. Children were teased at school about living near the haunted apartment. Some families even broke leases not because of the cries themselves, but because the publicity made. As media fascination deepened, Apartment 12B began to take on a symbolic role in the city's cultural landscape. Journalists framed it as a metaphor for urban neglect, an empty apartment in a crowded housing market, left to rot while families struggled to find homes. Opinion pieces argued that the cries of 12B, whether real or imagined, represented the voices of those forgotten by the system. The poor, the missing, the invisible. In this sense, the legend grew beyond the paranormal, touching nerves about class, loss, and survival in the modern city. The story also sparked heated debates on television panels and online forums. Skeptics mocked believers as gullible, pointing to acoustics, hoaxes, or attention-seeking tenets. Believers countered with testimonies, timelines, and the repeated involvement of police officers who admitted hearing something inexplicable. The back-and-forth turned 12B into more than just a mystery. It became a battleground between rationalism and belief, science and folklore. Even artists began weaving the apartment into their work. Murals appeared in the neighborhood depicting a faceless figure weeping behind a door marked 12B. Poets published pieces likening the cries to the collective grief of a city that never sleeps. Musicians sampled recordings of alleged sobs from the apartment, looping them into haunting tracks that circulated online. In each case, the apartment was reimagined, reshaped, and remade into something larger than its physical walls. For locals, however, the cultural explosion was bittersweet. On the one hand, their neighborhood had gained notoriety, drawing in curious visitors, artists, and even tourism. On the other, they were left living beside the very thing being mythologized. While outsiders debated theories and consumed dramatizations, residents still faced sleepless nights, unexplained noises, and the lingering stigma of residing next to the city's most infamous address. By the early 2020s, Apartment 12B had transcended its origins to become a fixture in popular culture. Ghost hunting shows included it in top 10 haunted apartments lists, and travel blogs mentioned it alongside cemeteries and abandoned hospitals as a destination for urban explorers. The building, once anonymous, was now marked on digital maps by curious users labeling it the Crying Apartment. Tourists occasionally slipped into the lobby, phones ready, hoping to record something supernatural. The mainstream media, sensing the enduring fascination, revisited the story in anniversary specials. Headlines returned every few years: "The mystery of 12B still unsolved?" or "Why do the cries continue?" Each article recycled familiar details: the cries at 3:11 a.m., the disappearances, the police reports. Yet audiences devoured them as though hearing the story anew. The cycle ensured that Apartment 12B never truly faded from public memory. Social platforms played their part in keeping the legend alive. Short-form videos staged midnight challenges, daring users to knock on the door and wait. Podcasts retold the history with dramatic flair, while horror creators stitched testimonies into unsettling audio stories. Even skeptics, who mocked the tales as exaggerated urban myth, contributed to the spread. Every argument, every debunk, every sarcastic post kept the conversation alive. For residents, however, the cultural aftershocks were lasting. Many grew tired of being associated with a legend they neither wanted nor asked for. Children who grew up in the building reported feeling branded, as if their home was a spectacle. Some tenants confessed that the media attention was worse than the cries themselves. At least the cries came at night, while the attention never stopped. In the end, media coverage ensured Apartment 12B would never be just another unit. Whether viewed as a haunting, a metaphor, or a manufactured myth, it had become part of the city's identity, an unresolved ST. Despite decades of complaints, testimonies, and investigations, the case of Apartment 12B remains unresolved. No definitive evidence has ever explained the cries, and no official investigation has produced results beyond speculation. What lingers instead is an absence, a silence in the records that contrasts sharply with the voices so many claim to hear. That absence has become part of the mystery itself. For the residents, the apartment represents a question without an answer. To this day, neighbors still speak of the cries at odd hours, though fewer are willing to go on record. The stigma of living beside 12B remains strong, and many prefer not to draw attention to themselves. Yet privately, the stories persist. New tenants whisper of sleepless nights, of children waking frightened, of animals staring at the walls as though something unseen is moving behind them. Old tenants, long since relocated, carry the memory with them, speaking of it years later as though the cries had etched themselves into their lives. The persistence of these stories forces us to confront a larger truth. Some mysteries resist resolution. In a city built on logic, order, and procedure, Apartment 12B stands as a reminder that not everything fits neatly into a report or a file. The cries may be environmental, psychological, or supernatural. They may be a combination of all three. But whatever the cause, their effect is undeniable. People heard them, people feared them, and people's lives were changed by them. One of the most haunting aspects of Apartment 12B is not simply the cries themselves, but the way they echo across generations. In most urban legends, details shift and morph with time, each retelling bending the truth a little further. But with 12B, the opposite seems to be true. From the 1990s to today, the same details recur with unnerving precision. Cries of a woman and child, heard around 3:11 a.m., dragging sounds across empty floors, whispers that seem to call residents by name. The persistence of these accounts challenges easy dismissal. If this were mass hysteria, why would the stories remain so consistent across decades, told by people who never knew one another? This consistency is what makes skeptics uneasy. They can explain the occasional sound of old plumbing, the creaks of shifting wood, or even the power of suggestion among frightened neighbors. But they cannot explain why officers, outsiders, trained to rely on observation rather than rumor, also reported strange experiences inside the unit. They cannot explain the disappearances of tenants whose names now sit in unsolved case files. and they cannot explain why, despite countless inspections, no physical cause has ever been uncovered. The result is a paradox. The more one investigates apartment 12B, the less certain the answers become. Each explanation unravels under scrutiny, leaving behind only more questions. Perhaps that is why the legend has endured, because in a world that craves certainty, 12B offers only ambiguity. It is a reminder that silence can be as deafening as noise, and that sometimes, what we cannot explain is what frightens us most. For many who encounter the story, the most unsettling thought is not that apartment 12B might be haunted, but that it might not be. If the cries were never supernatural, then what caused them? Were they the echoes of violence that went unnoticed? A crime concealed behind closed doors, buried so deeply that only fragments remain in the form of sound? Or were they psychological projections, the collective fears of tenants in a decaying building manifesting as something tangible? In either case, the implications are chilling. A ghost suggests tragedy. A cover-up suggests complicity. Philosophers and cultural critics have pointed to 12B as an example of how urban spaces can absorb memory. Just as old battlefields or ruins carry a weight beyond their physical structures, perhaps this apartment became a vessel for sorrow, replaying an event that refuses to fade. Others counter that humans, not places, create these impressions. We tell stories, we pass them down, and over time the stories themselves begin to feel real. Apartment 12B might then be less a haunting than a mirror, a reflection of human need to explain the unexplained, even if the explanation terrifies us. What makes the mystery powerful is not only the unanswered questions, but the emotional residue it leaves. Residents describe not just hearing sounds, but feeling despair seep through the walls, as though the cries carried with them an echo of grief. Visitors often leave unsettled, even when nothing happens, reporting headaches, nausea, or an unshakable sense of unease. Whether psychological or paranormal, that lingering dread is real, and it ensures the legend endures. In the end, the mystery of apartment 12B endures not because of what we know, but because of what we don't. Each unanswered question, each unexplained sound, has built upon the last until the apartment itself feels less like a room and more like an idea, an unresolved echo in the heart of the city. The legend thrives precisely because it resists conclusion. Every attempt to solve it only opens new avenues of doubt, leaving the cries to linger in the imagination of anyone who hears the story. For residents, it is a daily reminder that some shadows never leave. For investigators, it is a case study in the limits of reason. For storytellers, it is an endless well of inspiration. And for those who have stood in that hallway, listening to a sound that should not exist, it is something far more personal, a brush with the unknown. Perhaps that is why apartment 12B continues to fascinate. It is not just about ghosts or echoes or unanswered calls to 311. It is about the human condition, the way we confront fear, the way we wrestle with uncertainty, and the way we create meaning from what lies beyond our understanding. The cries may never be explained, but their power lies in that very fact. So the story endures. Apartment 12B remains sealed in mystery, a place where the line between reality and legend blurs, and where every unanswered sound becomes part of a greater truth, that some doors, once opened, are never truly closed.